fortunate to have Dr. Smukler with us for the IRES seminar. He's joining us from the Faculty of Land and Food Systems, where he is Junior Chair in Agriculture and the Environment, working on sustainable agriculture, ecosystem services, and would you say you're a soil scientist?
Not in front of other soil scientists.
Right. He's a good kind of soil scientist. So he's going to talk to us today about his work with the Millennium Development Goals and the challenges of managing for multiple ecosystems. We have till 1:50, so we'll give your talk, and there'll probably be a little bit of time for questions.
Okay.
Thanks,
Great.
John.
If I seem a little bit discombobulated, it's because I am. This is my first semester of teaching, so I'm so hopefully I of course packed way too many slides in here, and I might drone on some things that I shouldn't. So maybe at the end I'll rush through things just so we can get to questions, but I think that's the most fun. So what I'm going to be talking about today, initially I'm just going to go over the Millennium Development Goals. Hopefully all of you know them, so it'll be a little review, but if not, it'll be good that you do know them. And then I'm going to talk about their connection to human well-being, and I'll define human well-being for everybody. I'm then going to talk a little more in depth about MDG number 7, my personal favorite as an agroecologist. I'm really interested in environmental sustainability. Then I'm going to talk about MDG number 7 in the context of one project site of the Millennium Villages. So I spent some time doing research at this one site. I'm going to talk about the results from that site to just put in context what MDG number 7 really does, and maybe then I'll talk about what it could do. Yeah, that's it. So the Millennium Development Goals. At the turn of the century, the community of nations got together and decided that extreme poverty was something that really was something that we had to tackle immediately. So together they developed 8 goals that would address this extreme poverty that affected about 1/7 of the whole planet, a billion people. These 8 goals include end poverty and hunger, gender equality, universal education, child health, maternal health, combating HIV and AIDS, MDG number 7, environmental sustainability, and global partnership. These 8 goals included 25 quantifiable targets and 60 indicators. So how are we doing on the MDGs? And I should also say that the MDGs were set to be achieved by 2015. And despite these lofty goals, there was actually not a really great plan to make good on them. So here we are, 2013. How are we doing? We're just a few years away from the deadline. So on MDG, I'm not going to go through all of them, just a few. So how are we doing on MDG number 1, poverty? How, between 1990 and 2015, the number of people who are earning less than $1 a day, and actually that $1 a day has been raised to $1.25. So in the light blue, which is kind of cut off, the light blue is 1990 values, and in the dark blue is this is the 2012 report. So those values are 2010. And then the red hash mark is the actual target. So you can see in some places in the world, like in East Asia, in China, we've gone from a very large number to well below our goal. In other places, like sub-Saharan Africa, we haven't quite gotten there yet. And it seems like we're still quite a ways away. And then when we look at all of these regions together, this one is excluding China. We're still pretty far away from the goal, but when you include China, it looks a lot better. So the message here is we've got a ways to go, but we do have one shining example out there of a country that's really doing well on this. When we look at the MDG number 1 in terms of hunger, we can see that between 1990 and 2008, there's been basically the same number of people who are food insecure, undernourished, but the percentage has actually gone down quite a bit. So in terms of MDG number 7, the goal is to ensure environmental sustainability, which, like the other goals, is lofty and quite broad. The targets here, I'm going to start with the target that we've actually done well on. So target 7C, have by 2015 the proportion of the population without sustainable access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation. So the indicators for that are the proportion of the population with access to water or improved sanitation. So we actually did pretty well. We have, in almost all cases, achieved our target ahead of schedule. And in terms of all of the MDGs, this is the star. So across developing nations, you can see that we're right there at the target. So that's the good news. Now the bad news. So this is a very vague statement. To integrate principles of sustainable development into country policies and programs and reverse the loss of environmental resources. Very vague. The indicators are a little more specific, and I'm just going to talk about these first two, the proportion of land covered by forest and the ratio of area protected by biological diversity. So, how are we doing on forests? Well, again, in Asia, China in particular, there's been quite a bit of reforestation. That's the good news. Bad news is that deforestation rates are largely the same or increasing. So the forest cover situation in general is a bad news story. In terms of biodiversity, also a bad news story. This is the IUCN Red List Index of Species Survival. This is from actually the 2011 MDG report, because the data for the 2012 report doesn't really do the story justice. And for all of the species on the red list, the index is basically going down. We're talking about mammals, birds, and amphibians. So my concern, and I think a lot of other people's concerns, that there may be some trade-offs involved in these goals, that are goals for reducing poverty in terms of the dollar a day, or how many people are undernourished, may be at odds with our goal for environmental sustainability. And the reason we might think that, when we look at the first green revolution, we achieved enormous increases in cereal production. So this is cereal production from 1960 to 2000, and we more than doubled our global production. And we did that mostly through the increased use of nitrogen, irrigation, and phosphorus. And pesticides also helped us quite a bit in this process. There was also a fair amount of land conversion over that same amount of time. So this is the distribution of cropland globally and the distribution of pasture. And overall, it's estimated that about 40% of the terrestrial ecosystem is in agricultural production. On top of that, we are seeing soil erosion at unprecedented levels. So basically we have a situation where agriculture is losing soil at 1 or 2 orders of magnitude greater than soil is being generated. It takes a very long time to generate soil. And globally, we have vast areas that we see degradation of soil increasing. And our understanding of degradation is actually very poor. And so this map is not very detailed because our data is not very good. We don't have a very good sense of what the status of soil is and how it's changing. Agriculture, through erosion, through intensive use of nutrients, has had an extreme impact on surface waters globally. So this is an image of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico as the Mississippi Delta drains out into that region. Agriculture represents about 14% of greenhouse gas emissions just from soil itself through the use of fertilizer and tillage. You have the release of nitrous oxides, methane, and CO2. In addition, we have another 17% that's contributed by forestry to the global greenhouse total. Much of this deforestation is caused by conversion from forest to agriculture. And people argue about how much is actually due to agriculture, but that's something that we probably may never have a good number on. So why do we care about these non-production components of the environment? You know, as long as we're meeting that $1 a day, that $1.25 a day goal, as long as people are being fed, why do we care about the soil, the water, greenhouse gas emissions? So I argue, others do as well, that it's not just about being fed, it's not just about making enough money, but it's actually having a sense of well-being. And well-being, defined by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, is the basic material needs for a good life. Freedom of choice, health, good social relations, and personal security. And what ensures that is very complicated. And for sure, it's more than just getting presents at Christmas. I mean, this is my one-year-old niece who, I mean, when you give her a present, she's just incredibly ecstatic. Her human well-being score just goes through the roof. But in fact, you know, she needs food, water, shelter, energy, among a number of other things in order to have all of these. So for her and for us, it's fairly straightforward how we get there, or seemingly straightforward. You know, we turn on the tap, we flip on the light switch, we make enough money to purchase a house. But for others, it's a little more complicated. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment goes on to detail out the constituents of well-being, and they put forth this hypothesis that it is our surrounding ecosystem that really ensures that we get all of these components, these constituents of well-being. So security, health, freedom of choice, these are all connected to the ecological services that the environment supplies us, including supporting services that include nutrient cycling or soil formation, or provisioning services such as food production or fuel wood production, even cultural services, the aesthetics of a landscape. So in wildland ecosystems, when we look at the availability of those ecosystem services that are connected hypothetically to our well-being, and we look at the distribution of the availability of those services, when we look at things like water quality regulation or water flow or fuel wood, wildland ecosystems may produce all that we need. What they don't do very well is produce crop foods. And crop foods, as opposed to wildland foods, have many more calories per unit area. So in agricultural systems, it's quite the opposite. We get many calories per unit area, but we don't do so good on these other things. And this is just a hypothetical visualization of what the services might be. So there, we have this hypothesis that ecosystem services and well-being are correlated. But then when we look at our various indexes of human well-being, we have this paradox. So this is the Human Development Index from 1975 to 2000. And across the board, it's going up. I mean, sub-Saharan Africa is far below everyone else, but it's still going up. But yet, I just showed you how ecosystem services in general, and maybe if I wasn't convincing there, believe me, they're all systems are going down. So, was the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment just wrong? Well, so there's 4 hypotheses that relate to this paradox. The first could be, maybe our indicators aren't so good. Maybe Human Development Index doesn't capture this relationship. Well, certainly GDP probably does a very poor job of that. Most of us might agree with that. Maybe it's just that our advances in agriculture just surpass all those other ecosystem services in terms of importance. And that makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, who cares about long-term soil productivity if you can't feed your kids that day, right? Maybe there's just a decoupling of this relationship because we have all these great technological advancements. I mean, who needs fuel wood when you have nuclear power, right? And maybe well-being and ecosystem services really are linked, but it's just that the linkages we won't see for years to come. And actually, this is what I think is going on. That there are many of the ecosystem services that we rely on, even in places like Canada, that we're just not directly connected to. And it's not until over time, when our soil washes into the Fraser River Delta, that we'll realize that really we are relying on ecosystem services, on soil regeneration. And then I would also present the idea that maybe it's just that even when we see those human indexes going up, that it's not reflecting the very poorest of the poor. So there is a large population out there in the world that really is very closely linked to their land. That when you don't have access to piped water, you're going to be taking water out of a stream or out of a well. If you don't have access to that nuclear power plant that I was talking about, you're going to be cutting down trees to cook your food, to keep your house warm. So, today, we're talking about the next green revolution. My old boss, Pedro Sanchez, calls it the Green Revolution 2.0. And he calls it 2.0 because he says we're going to do things differently this time. So the challenge is 1 in 7 of us are still undernourished. And then there's 7 billion of us, and by 2050 there's going to be 9 billion of us. So that's the big challenge of Green Revolution 2.0. And then we now know that the strategies that we used in the 1.0 had all these externalities: the water, the soil, pesticides. So there's a crowd out there who thinks that one way to do 2.0 is to just keep what we've been doing, but do it better. So there's a debate of extensive versus intensive farming. And the idea is, if we've got a limited land area, we've got the same land area here and the same land area here. If we really intensively farm that, if we just maximize its production through the use of fertilizer, irrigation, and pesticides, we can leave all this other land completely untouched. Alternatively, if we use what's currently being used for most of the world right now, which is largely an organic agricultural production, very few inputs, we would require all the land to be farmed, right? So where I was working in Western Kenya, the farmers were, without inputs, were growing maize at about 1 ton per hectare. In Iowa, we can easily hit 10 tons per hectare, just to give you a sense of the difference. I would throw out there that there's actually an in-between these two extremes, the land sparing versus land sharing, or wildlife-friendly farming. That there's a way that we can integrate some ecological principles into the way we produce food, and that we might get a more even distribution of these ecosystem services that we need. And this idea was tested. Tested is kind of an extreme word. We looked at this idea in the Millennium Villages Project. So the Millennium Villages Project was the brainchild of Jeffrey Sachs, Pedro Sanchez, and a number of other folks who were concerned that the MDGs didn't have a roadmap to success. That there's great ideas, but we don't know how to do it. So Jeff and Pedro's idea was, look, we'll try this out in a few places around the world. Look at, do it the best we can, the best we know how, learn lessons from that, and then take those lessons and roll it out on a wide scale. And the best they knew how was to come up with this integrated development plan where and they also wanted to make this a roadmap that was doable, it was affordable for the global community. So at $120 per person, they invested in agriculture, health, education, infrastructure, and environment in an integrated fashion. And they did this at 14 village sites in sub-Saharan Africa. And each of these sites were picked so that they represented various agroecological zones. So, a lesson from the humid tropics could be would not necessarily be applied to the lessons in the dry tropics. And there was enormous progress. So the Millennium Village Project was launched in Sauri, Kenya in 2005. After the first 3 years, they rolled out or released a bunch of results, and these results were very promising. In many of the villages that had maize, you saw a tripling of yields in some cases. In some cases, more. There was an extreme increase in the availability of improved drinking water. And they had enormous success in their school meals program, a program where students would actually get their nutritional needs met at school through a farmer cooperative-led feeding program. So now I'm going to talk about the work that I did in Sauri, Kenya, in Western Kenya, to look at, this intensification process, this integrated development process, what were the impacts on the environment? Sauri is one of many villages in what was the Millennium Village Project. All of these villages were part of the project, received the integrated development package, but only Sauri was the one that got the scientific lens. So Sauri is a mixed maize cropping system. Population density very high for an agricultural landscape, 481 persons. It's a wet area. And at the start of the project, between 60 and 70% were making of the population were making less than $1 a day. The interventions over the course of 5 years had many positive results. More than almost 4,000 farmers adopted higher value crops, such as these greenhouse production of tomatoes. There were a number of ponds to grow tilapia installed throughout the project. There was widespread use of DAP, diammonium phosphate, and urea fertilizers. They were prescribed at 80 kilograms per hectare for nitrogen. And just to put that into context, before the project, the average fertilizer use was at 8 kilograms per hectare. Most farmers around the world will give corn between 150 and 300 units. So they had enormous gains in productivity. They went from 1.9 tons per hectare to 5 tons. It's half that 10-ton yield that I was talking about in Iowa. So this is the granary that they constructed in the village site to ensure that their harvest was not affected by post-harvest losses. There was also a number of investments made in animal production throughout the system, and a huge emphasis on the distribution of agroforestry species for fuel wood, for timber, and for food. So the questions that my team, the environment team, asked at this site were basically the MDG 7 questions. So how are we doing on deforestation, biodiversity loss? And I didn't actually go over the fact that part of MDG number 7 is to reduce the per capita greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And this one is not part of MDG number 7, soil degradation. But we actually think that that should be at the top of the list. And so we monitored it. So our approach was, how are we doing on top? Okay. So our approach was, we had a baseline survey where we did both a landscape inventory and a household survey. And then after 5 years, we did another household survey and landscape inventory. Our inventory design was a wide transect design where we had these randomly placed transects distributed across the village area. We used the land degradation surveillance framework methodology to collect data on soils, vegetation. We then analyzed satellite imagery, QuickBird, high-resolution imagery, using spectral mixing analysis and recursive regression trees to develop a detailed land use land cover map at baseline and then at 5 years. This is an image of the Y transect and then the land use land cover map. And we identified 4 classes of land use in that region: agroforestry, cropland, homesteads, which is basically the land surrounding the homes that people in this area delineate their yards with hedgerows or fences. And then there's just other waterways, ponds, roads. So this is what cropland might look like in the circles up here, what agroforestry would look like, homesteads, the household yards delineated by these trees, and then just random other examples. So when we looked at land cover, so we had this large, intensive development project move into the area. We actually, after 5 years, don't see much overall change in the distribution of land cover. So agroforestry overall stays about the same. Cropland stays about the same. But when we look at the actual location of those land uses, we see it's actually quite a dynamic landscape. So 27% of the landscape went from, say, agroforestry to cropland, or from cropland to agroforestry. So there was actually quite a bit of land use change. So what did that land use change mean in terms of the various ecosystem services? So I told you that there was a large effort to distribute trees. We actually saw a fairly large increase in above ground biomass across that entire landscape. And when we look at where that biomass largely increased was on croplands, but even more so on homesteads. So people, when having access to trees, were planting the trees right around their homes so that they could intensively manage them and protect them. And we had, because of that increase in biomass, one of the members of our team estimated that fuel security increased from 48% to 79% of the community. In terms of biodiversity loss, in our inventory, we initially saw 47 tree species, and with many different uses. And after 5 years, we saw an increase in the number of species richness across the landscape. And again, we saw those increases on cropland and homestead largely. When we looked at the global warming potential of that landscape, so we put on a lot of biomass, but then we were also using a lot of fertilizer. And the project often gets blasted for the use of fertilizer. And we can talk about that afterwards. But just to put in perspective, the emissions factor related to that fertilizer is very low. So these calculations are done in orange on post-application using Davidson's estimate of 2.4% of the application blowing off as N2O. And then the yellow is pre-application fertilizer global warming potential, so the energy used to create the fertilizer. So when you compare this to the amount sequestered in tree biomass over the 5-year period, it's dramatic. So if we're thinking of the land sparing, land sharing idea, it may be that this fertilizer use enabled farmers to plant trees across the landscape. Then, when we look at soil carbon, across the landscape, we see a decline in soil carbon. So, soil carbon is one of those measurements that soil scientists like to point out as a good indicator for soil quality. It represents the amount of soil organic matter that's in the soil, and we would have liked to have seen this go up. But 5 years, it's a short amount of time, so maybe we wouldn't see it go up, but seeing it go down is not so good. Where we did see it largely go down was, again, in the cropland and in the homestead. And so those two areas are the most intensively managed areas in that landscape. So what did we learn from that Soury case study? So deforestation, you saw a 60% increase in tree biomass. In terms of biodiversity loss, almost 3 times the average number of tree species. In terms of soil degradation, you did see indications of soil degradation. And in terms of global warming, you have that image in your head of the difference of the tree biomass and the fertilizer emissions. So those are all lessons that we learned that are very difficult to say we tested, because the Millennium Villages project actually, in the initial stages of the project didn't have a control, and it was only after 3 years that Jeff Sachs decided to implement a control because he was getting blasted from the scientific community. And so what I think we should be talking about is not so much the before and after, or this compared to what I would say maybe is a tough control after 3 years installing a control. to look at the extremely rich data set that we have at these 14 village sites. There are enormous lessons to be learned in terms of the variation in how these integrated programs actually succeeded. And there's a great potential to ask important questions. What are the sectoral synergies? It's very rare that you have an intense lens on a development project that has this type of integration. So we could be asking, what is the relationship between education and environment? Why did we get all those trees in the landscape? And what's the relationship between health and agriculture? And there's been some really interesting work coming out of the project on that note. And what are the trade-offs? There were a number of roads installed across that landscape. What did that mean in terms of the environment? So certainly there may have been deforestation, but overall there was afforestation. What other impacts were there? What about agriculture and the environment? I mean, largely, except for the carbon story, this was a good news story for agriculture. Tripled yields, reduced greenhouse gas emissions. But we didn't look at water. What happened to water quality in this system? What about erosion rates? So with that type of information, with the information from all the different sectors, we can begin to parse out what these trade-offs might look like. And this, again, is totally hypothetical situation. The Millennium Village project is just now getting to the stage where it can look at these potential trade-offs. To look at, how does calorie production change when you have an increase in food security, or fuel provisioning change when you have increase in soil or decrease in soil quality. So going forward, there's no great roadmap. I mean, the Millennium Village project has not yet produced the lessons that are going to enable us to hit the Millennium Development Goals by 2015. I mean, we've got a couple of years. So we really need to start thinking about, what happens after 2015. We need a new set of targets. We need a new set of goals. And are the strategies that we're using right now, are they working? We really need to examine what we've got right now and to develop a better plan. Because right now, we don't really have a solid plan. Foley and a group of his colleagues put together a set of really simple solutions that could, at least in terms of ag and the environment, provide some, a great deal of benefit. So they suggest stop expansion of agriculture, close yield gaps, increase agricultural resource efficiency, and increase the delivery by shifting diets and reducing waste. And all four of these are very complicated and integrated and challenging, but I highly recommend sort of thinking more in depth about how we actually implement these strategies. And then finally, we need to think about what happens after 2015. What do we do with the MDGs? Do we just say, oh, we did some right, we didn't get these other ones? Good job, guys. Or do we go to MDG 2.0? Or there's been a lot of talk about, instead of MDGs, having sustainable development goals. Regardless of what happens, what I've learned and what I would share with you is, and I haven't learned that much, but what I would share is we definitely need these targets to be locally appropriate. That, setting a global target for per capita greenhouse gas emissions is great if it's focused on us here. But to expect that folks in rural Africa should reduce their greenhouse gas emissions just seems absurd to me. They need to be meaningful for the local conditions. So, if we have this deforestation target, that has a lot of implications for greenhouse gas emissions and habitat, but what if you live in a grassland? I mean, grassland habitats are incredibly important. Wetland habitats are incredibly important. They need to be doable. These targets need to be something that we not only can achieve, but we can measure. We can measure well and locally so that people are involved and recognize the importance of meeting these targets. These can't just be some lofty politician in New York setting the targets. And then they have to be reflective of long-term goals. So what scares me is setting the next set of MDGs for 2020 at the expense of I showed you my niece up there, 1 year old. When she's old, I want the MDGs to still be good, still be done. We don't want to just push off the problems to the next generation. So, for example, we cannot, I'll say that again, we cannot sacrifice our soil for the MDGs now. Like we don't have another set of soil waiting on the moon for us. We have to protect that here and now. And I would definitely love to talk to you all about what you think should be done about the MDGs, because it's definitely a debate right now. No one has a clear answer that I've heard that I like.
We probably have time for 2 or 3 questions before we have to leave at 1:50.
In terms of the trees that you saw planted that were planted on farms, how much of those were exotic and how much were indigenous?
I don't know offhand what the ratio was. There's actually a paper coming out specifically about the lessons learned from the tree nursery program that describes in detail the ratio. But I do know that the people working on that program were really focused on a diversity of tree species and specifically trying to get a diversity of native tree species. That said, there were large tracts of timber production that were focused on eucalyptus. Eucalyptus in that area grew up amazing stuff.
And one other thing, was there anything about food trees in there?
Food
trees.
Food tree, yeah. I think there was a big push to try to get fruit tree, agroforestry species that had multiple uses. So either fuel wood, timber, or food.
So I recognize that you were on the environment team, but could you speak a bit more to the social context? So for instance, were there markets for the tomatoes and other things that were being grown with the new production systems? How culturally appropriate were the tree species, in terms of food or other uses? Any context in terms of how people reacted or well-being indicators on the survey that showed radical shifts?
I mean, I can just comment based on our team, overall team meetings. And certainly there were people looking at those aspects of the project. And my sense is that if I had to guess what how the human well-being index was going, it seemed like it was going up. But I'm reluctant to say, because I haven't seen that data. Most of the time, yeah.
So there was nothing that stood out in terms of, a reaction to one tree that was promoted and planted or anything else that sort of people didn't receive?
No, other than, the nursery here's a good lesson. So the nursery program was largely being pushed by the project initially, and then it started dividing itself up into private nurseries. So people recognized that there was this huge demand for trees and started producing their own nurseries to make money. So, that to me says that it wasn't just the project that was pushing this and that it may last beyond the duration.
And were the things like the tomatoes being sold at other markets or just being consumed locally?
Oh, they were definitely going to market. So Kisumu is about 30-minute drive away from this village site. So and this village site is a pretty unique situation in the overall MVP project, in that there have been a lot of agroforestry work done here before. The market was relatively close and accessible.
I've got a bunch of questions for you that I'll ask later, Sean. But for now, I guess I'm interested in your perspective on the scale-up ability of the Millennium Villages program. So is there anything that came out either from this particular study site or your sort of knowledge of the program as a whole that, you know, shapes your view of whether this is going to be, these techniques are going to be effective in terms of really scaling up the types of programs that were instituted at these pilot sites, or not?
Well, one aspect of the project that I did mention was that for many of the sites, and they all implemented things a little bit differently, but they made an effort to try to include government personnel in the operations. So again, pretty sure Salary had people sequestered from government to work on the project. So in terms of at least the connection to government, there was that effort being made. I don't know how that could roll out and expand across the different sectors of government. I think that question is actually, the scalability is actually going to be put to test right now. So in Nigeria, they are currently scaling up. So they're taking not the full package as far as I understand. And I've been here a year, so I'm not up to speed on what's going on there. And again, I was on the lowly environment team, so I wasn't really tuned into the whole scaling up part. But the Nigerian government has, they're basically putting the plan together and rolling it out. So I think there will be some enormous lessons to learn in that effort. But I think that's the critical question.
You said it's an investment of $120 a year for the MVPs. Was that a rolling, recurring cost, or is, what? Is the idea, I'm assuming it's not $120 per person, or $120 per person forever kind of thing. What's the sustainability plan from that perspective?
Right. So Jeff's idea was, as far as I understand it from reading from books, there's this downward spiral of poverty that it's pretty much inescapable. It's very difficult to escape. And the idea with the $120 was to boost people out of that spiral, to give them a way to get beyond this trend. And it is uncertain how long you need that boost. And initially the project was supposed to be 5 years, and now it's 10 years. So how long does it take until you can pull that $120 worth of subsidy out of the system? I don't know. But then, when you think about the access that we have to subsidies, we, depending on your tax bracket, you may be heavily subsidized or not. So I think the goal is that it stops being $120 from the global community, from Madonna and Matt Damon, and starts being a locally wrought infrastructure from the government.
This will be the last one. Quick question. Were neighboring communities jealous?
That's a good question.
And how is that managed?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I mentioned that there wasn't a control village at the beginning of the project. That was because the people who were setting up the project really thought it was ethically wrong to distribute this intensive aid in one area and not to another, and yet still put the lens on those other people. So I think the evidence is largely anecdotal up until the point of the control village. After 3 years, they selected these control villages, and then they started putting the lens on those sites. So I don't know, but hopefully someone.